The arrival at Willowbrook Manor, the carriage wheels rolled steadily along the cobblestone path, their gentle rhythm creating a soothing melody that had nearly lulled young Eleanor Hartwell to sleep. The stones. She pressed her face to the cool glass window and peered through the gathering dusk of the English countryside. The year was 1823, and the world beyond the carriage window looked as if it had been painted by a master artist with the softest of brushes. Rolling hills stretched endlessly in every direction, their emerald slopes dotted with sheep that looked like tiny white clouds that had somehow drifted down from the sky. Ancient oak trees stood like gentle guardians along the roadside, their branches swaying in the warm summer breeze. The air carried the sweet fragrance of wild roses and honeysuckle, and somewhere in the distance, Eleanor could hear the melodic song of a nightingale welcoming the approaching night. Eleanor was 16 years old, with eyes the color of autumn leaves and hair that caught the light like spun gold. She had been traveling for 3 days from her family's estate in London to reach Willowbrook Manor, where she would spend the summer months with her Grattan Cordelia. The journey had been long but peaceful, and with each mile that passed, Eleanor felt a growing sense of anticipation and wonder as the carriage rounded a gentle bend in the road. Eleanor caught her first glimpse of Willowbrook Manor, and her breath caught in her throat. The manor house rose before her like something from a fairy tale, its honey-colored stone walls glowing warmly in the fading light. Tall windows sparkled like jewels, and ivy climbed gracefully up the walls, creating patterns of green lace against the ancient stones. The roofline was adorned with elegant chimneys and gables, and a weathered stone balcony overlooked gardens that seemed to stretch on forever. The carriage began its slow descent down the winding drive, which was lined with towering elm trees whose branches formed a natural cathedral overhead. Dappled sunlight filtered through the leaves, creating patterns of gold and shadow that danced across the carriage roof. Eleanor could hear the gentle splash of water somewhere nearby. She spotted a small stone bridge crossing over a babbling brook that meandered through the grounds. The gardens that surrounded Willowbrook Manor were unlike anything Eleanor had ever seen. Even in the gathering twilight, she could make out carefully tended flower beds bursting with color. Roses climbed up trellises and spilled over stone walls, their petals creating carpets of pink and white and deep crimson. Lavender bushes released their soothing fragrance into the evening air, and somewhere among the flowers, she could hear the gentle hum of bees going about their evening work. As the carriage drew to a stop in the circular drive before the manor's front entrance, Eleanor felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. The day's journey had been long, But now she was here, in this magical place that already felt like home. The driver, a kindly man named Thomas, who had been in her family's service for many years, climbed down from his perch and opened the carriage door with a gentle smile. "Welcome to Willowbrook Manor, Miss Eleanor," he said softly, extending his hand to help her down. "I do believe you're going to love it here." Eleanor stepped down onto the gravel drive, her traveling boots crunching softly on the small stones. The air was filled with the sounds of evening settling over the countryside. Crickets had begun their gentle chorus, and somewhere in the distance, she could hear the soft lowing of cattle being brought in for the night. The manor house stood before her, its windows glowing with warm lamplight, and she could smell the comforting scent of wood smoke drifting from one of the chimneys. Before she could take more than a few steps toward the house, the heavy oak front door opened with a soft creak, and a woman emerged onto the stone steps. Eleanor recognized her immediately as Grand Cordelia, though she had not seen her in several years. Cordelia Hartwell was a woman in her 60s, with silver hair that caught the moonlight and eyes that sparkled with warmth and intelligence. She was dressed in a simple but elegant gown of deep blue silk, and she moved with the grace of someone who had spent her life in harmony with the natural world around her. "Eleanor." "My dear child," Aunt Cordelia called out, her voice carrying the gentle cadence of someone who had spent years speaking to flowers and birds and all the creatures of the garden. "How wonderful to see you again. Come inside. You must be exhausted from your journey." Eleanor walked up the stone steps and into her aunt's welcoming embrace. Cordelia smelled of lavender and roses, and her hug was warm and comforting, like being wrapped in a soft blanket fresh from the garden. As they held each other, Eleanor felt the last of her travel weariness melt away, replaced by a sense of belonging and contentment. "I've been so looking forward to your visit," Cordelia said, holding Eleanor at arm's length to look at her properly. "My goodness, how you've grown. Akil, you're quite the young lady now, aren't you? Come, let's get you settled. Mrs. Pemberton has prepared your room, and Cook has made your favorite lemon cakes." They walked together through the manor's front hall, which was even more beautiful than Eleanor had imagined. The walls were lined with family portraits, their subjects seeming to smile down at her in welcome. A grandfather clock stood in one corner, its gentle tick-tock adding to the peaceful atmosphere. Fresh flowers from the garden had been arranged in tall vases, filling the air with their sweet fragrance, and candles flickered in wall sconces, casting dancing shadows on the polished wood floors. Mrs. Pemberton, the housekeeper, appeared as if by magic, her round face beaming with pleasure. She was a woman of middle years, with graying hair tucked neatly under a white cap, and an apron that was always spotless despite her constant work in the gardens alongside Cordelia. She had been with the family for more than 20 years, and Eleanor remembered her as someone who always had freshly baked biscuits and gentle words of encouragement. "Miss Eleanor, welcome home," Mrs. Pemberton said, her voice warm with genuine affection. "I've prepared the rose room for you, just as you requested in your letter. The windows look out over the herb garden, and I've placed fresh roses from the garden on your dressing table." Eleanor followed Mrs. Pemberton up the wide staircase, her hand trailing along the smooth banister that had been polished to a warm glow. The stairs were covered with a thick carpet that muffled their footsteps, and portraits of long-ago family members watched them climb with kind eyes. At the top of the stairs, a long hallway stretched in both directions, its walls lined with more family portraits and landscapes of the estate, painted by various family members over the years. The rose room was everything Eleanor had hoped it would be. It was a corner room with tall windows on two sides, and even in the evening light, she could see the gardens stretching out beyond the glass that moved gently in the evening breeze. A comfortable four-poster bed dominated one wall, its posts carved with delicate flowers and vines. A small writing desk sat beneath one window, and a comfortable chair was positioned near the fireplace for reading. "I hope you'll be comfortable here," Mrs. Pemberton said, bustling about the room and adjusting the already perfect arrangements. "I've had the windows opened to let in the evening air, and I've placed extra blankets in the wardrobe in case the nights grow cool. Dinner will be served in an hour, but if you're too tired, Cook would be happy to send something up to your room." Eleanor walked to one of the windows and looked out over the gardens. Even in the growing darkness, she could make out the shapes of flower beds and pathways winding through the grounds. The moon was beginning to rise, casting silver light over everything, and she could hear the gentle splash of water from what must be a fountain somewhere in the gardens. "It's perfect," Eleanor said softly, turning back to Mrs. Pemberton with a grateful smile. "Thank you so much for preparing everything so beautifully." After Mrs. Pemberton left, Eleanor unpacked her traveling trunk with slow, careful movements. She was tired from the journey, but also excited to be here in this magical place. Her journal and writing supplies went on the desk by the window, where she would be able to look out at the gardens while she wrote as she worked. Eleanor found herself listening to the sounds of the manor settling into evening. Somewhere below, she could hear the gentle clink of dishes as the table was set for dinner. A clock chimed the hour with a soft, melodic sound, and she could hear the distant sound of someone playing the pianoforte in what must be the drawing room. The melody was gentle and flowing, like water over stones, and it seemed to capture perfectly the peaceful atmosphere of Willowbrook Manor. When she had finished unpacking, Eleanor changed into a fresh dress and brushed her hair until it shone in the lamplight. She took a moment to look at herself in the mirror, noting how the journey and the change of scene had already brought color to her cheeks and brightness to her eyes. She felt different here, more alive somehow, as if the very air of Willowbrook Manor had awakened something in her soul. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts, and she opened it, to find Aunt Cordelia standing in the hallway, now dressed in a simple but elegant gown of deep green silk. Her silver hair was arranged in a becoming style, and she wore a cameo brooch that had belonged to Eleanor's grandmother. "Are you ready for dinner, my dear?" Cordelia asked. "I thought we might eat in the small dining room tonight, just the two of us. It's more intimate, and we'll have a chance to catch up properly." Eleanor nodded eagerly, and together they made their way downstairs. The small dining room was indeed intimate, with a round table set for two and candles flickering in a crystal chandelier overhead. The windows looked out over the gardens, and Eleanor could see the moon rising higher in the sky, casting silver light over the flower beds and pathways. The meal was simple but delicious. Cook had prepared roasted chicken with herbs from the garden, fresh vegetables that had been picked that very afternoon, and warm bread that filled the room with its comforting aroma. For dessert, there were the promised lemon cakes, light and sweet and perfect after the satisfying meal. As they ate, Cordelia told Eleanor about the manor and its history. The house had been in the family for more than 200 years, built by Eleanor's great-great-grandfather as a country retreat. Over the years, each generation had added to the gardens and made improvements to the house, but always with respect for the natural beauty of the landscape. "The gardens are really the heart of Willowbrook," Cordelia explained, her eyes growing distant as she spoke. "Each generation has added something new, but always in harmony with what came before. There are formal gardens near the house, with geometric patterns and carefully trimmed hedges. But as you move further from the house, the gardens become more natural, more wild. There's a woodland garden where bluebells bloom in spring, and a water garden with lily ponds and a small waterfall." Eleanor listened with growing fascination as her aunt described the various areas of the estate. There was a rose garden with varieties that had been collected from all over the world, a herb garden where medicinal and culinary plants grew side by side, and a kitchen garden that provided fresh vegetables for the household. Beyond the formal gardens, there were meadows where wildflowers bloomed and ancient trees provided shade and shelter for countless birds and small animals. I spend most of my time in the gardens, Cordelia continued, her voice growing soft with affection. It's where I feel most at peace, most connected to the world around me. There's something about working with growing things, about being part of the cycle of the seasons that fills the soul in ways that nothing else can. As dinner progressed, Eleanor found herself relaxing completely for the first time in months. The gentle conversation, the delicious food, and the peaceful atmosphere of the manor all combined to create a sense of deep contentment. She told her aunt about her life in London, about her studies and her interests, but found herself speaking more and more about her longing for a deeper connection with the natural world. I feel so restless in London, Eleanor confided as they finished their dessert. Everything is so rushed, so artificial. I find myself dreaming of quiet places, of gardens and growing things. I think that's why I was so eager to come here for the summer. Cordelia smiled knowingly. I understand completely, my dear. I felt the same way when I was your age. The city has its place, of course, but there's something about the countryside that feeds the soul. I have a feeling you're going to love it here. After dinner, they moved to the drawing room, where Cordelia played the pianoforte, while Eleanor curled up in a comfortable chair by the fireplace. The music was gentle and soothing. Pieces by composers like Bach and Handel that seemed to capture the peaceful rhythm of country life. The room was lit by candles and the gentle glow of the fire, creating an atmosphere of warmth and comfort. As the evening wore on, Eleanor found her eyelids growing heavy. The combination of the long journey, the satisfying meal, and the peaceful atmosphere of the manor had left her feeling wonderfully relaxed and sleepy. Cordelia noticed her nodding and smiled gently. "You must be exhausted, my dear," she said, closing the piano and moving to Eleanor's chair. "Why don't you go up to bed? Tomorrow we'll have our first proper exploration of the gardens. I have so much to show you." Eleanor nodded gratefully and rose from her chair. Cordelia walked with her to the bottom of the stairs, where they exchanged a warm good-night embrace. "Sleep well, dear one," Cordelia said softly. "Sweet dreams." Lenore climbed the stairs slowly, her hand trailing along the smooth banister. Manor was settling into its nighttime quiet, with only the gentle ticking of clocks and the soft sound of wind in the trees outside. Her room was just as she had left it, with moonlight streaming through the windows and the scent of roses drifting in on the evening breeze. She changed into her nightgown and brushed her hair, then moved to the window to look out at the gardens one more time before bed. The moon was full and bright, casting silver light over the flower beds and pathways. She could see the shapes of trees and bushes, the gleam of water from what must be a pond or fountain, and the gentle movement of flowers swaying in the night breeze. As she stood there, Eleanor felt a profound sense of peace and anticipation. She was here, in this magical place, with a whole summer ahead of her to explore and discover. Tomorrow would bring new adventures, new sights and sounds and experiences. But for now, she was content to simply be here, in this moment, surrounded by the gentle sounds and scents of the English countryside. She climbed into the comfortable bed and pulled the soft covers up to her chin. The mattress was firm but comfortable, and the pillows were filled with down that seemed to cradle her head perfectly. Through the open windows, she could hear the gentle sounds of night settling over the estate. An owl hooted somewhere in the distance, and she could hear the rustle of small animals moving through the garden. The sound of water gurgling over stones came from somewhere nearby, and the night air carried the scent of jasmine and night-blooming flowers as Eleanor drifted toward sleep. She thought about the day's journey and her arrival at Willowbrook Manor. Everything about the place felt right. From the honey-colored stone walls to the carefully tended gardens to the warm welcome from Aunt Cordelia and Mrs. Pemberton. She felt as if she had found a place where she truly belonged, where she could be herself and explore her deepest interests and passions. The moon continued its journey across the sky, casting silver light through the windows of the rose room. Eleanor's breathing grew deeper and more regular as sleep claimed her, and her dreams were filled with images of gardens and flowers, of peaceful pathways winding through ancient trees, and of a summer filled with discovery and wonder in her dreams. She walked through moonlit gardens where flowers glowed with their own inner light, where butterflies danced in the air like living jewels, and where every breath brought new fragrances and new delights. She dreamed of mornings filled with birdsong and dew-covered flowers, of afternoons spent reading in the shade of ancient trees, and of evenings like this one, filled with gentle conversation and the peaceful rhythm of country life. The manor itself seemed to embrace her as she slept, its ancient walls holding her safely, while the gardens outside whispered their secrets to the night wind. Somewhere in the distance, the church clock in the village chimed midnight, its gentle bronze notes floating across the countryside like a blessing. Eleanor stirred slightly in her sleep, smiled, and settled deeper into her dreams. Outside her window, the gardens of Willowbrook Manor continued their eternal dance with the seasons. Night-blooming flowers opened their petals to the moonlight, releasing their fragrance into the still air. A fox padded silently along one of the pathways, pausing to drink from the small stream that meandered through the grounds. Somewhere in the herb garden, a cat stalked a mouse with patient precision. while overhead bats fluttered through the air in their endless hunt for insects. The moon reached its zenith and began its slow descent toward the western horizon. Long shadows across the formal gardens and turning the water in the lily pond into liquid silver. The night air grew cooler, and a gentle breeze stirred the leaves of the great oak trees that had stood sentinel over the estate for centuries. In the rose room, Eleanor slept peacefully, her dreams filled with images of the adventures that awaited her in the days to come. She dreamed of walking through garden paths she had never seen, of discovering secret corners and hidden treasures, of learning the names and properties of flowers and herbs from her wise and gentle aunt. She dreamed of mornings spent in the greenhouse, afternoons in the library reading about botany and horticulture, and evenings like this one filled with good conversation and the peaceful rhythm of country life. As the night wore on and the moon began its descent toward the horizon, Eleanor's sleep grew even deeper and more restful. The combination of the long journey, the warm welcome, and the peaceful atmosphere of Willowbrook Manor had left her feeling more relaxed and content than she had in months. Her body was finally able to release the tension and stress of city life, and her mind was free to wander through dreams of gardens and growing things. The manor continued its nighttime vigil, its ancient walls holding the sleeping household safely while the gardens outside whispered their secrets to the night. Wind. Somewhere in the distance, the church clock in the village chimed midnight, its gentle bronze notes floating across the countryside like a blessing. Eleanor stirred slightly in her sleep, smiled, and settled deeper into her dreams. Outside her window, the gardens of Willowbrook Manor continued their eternal dance with the seasons. Night-blooming flowers opened their petals to the moonlight, releasing their fragrance into the still air. A fox padded silently along one of the pathways, pausing to drink from the small stream that meandered through the grounds. Somewhere in the herb garden, a cat stalked a mouse with patient precision, while overhead bats fluttered through the air in their endless hunt for insects. The moon reached its zenith and began its slow descent toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across the formal gardens and turning the water in the lily pond into liquid silver. The night air grew cooler, and a gentle breeze stirred the leaves of the great oak trees that had stood sentinel over the estate for centuries. In the rose room, Eleanor slept peacefully, her dreams filled with images that awaited her in the days to come. She dreamed of walking through garden paths she had never seen, of discovering secret corners and hidden treasures, of learning the names and properties of flowers and herbs from her wise and gentle aunt. She dreamed of mornings spent in the greenhouse, afternoons in the library, reading about botany and horticulture, and evenings like this one, filled with good conversation and the peaceful rhythm of country life. As the night wore on and the moon began its descent toward the horizon, Eleanor's sleep grew even deeper and more restful. The combination of the long journey, the warm welcome, and the peaceful atmosphere of Willowbrook Manor had left her feeling more relaxed and content than she had in months. Her body was finally able to release the tension and stress of city life, and her mind was free to wander through dreams of gardens and growing things. The manor continued its nighttime vigil, its ancient walls holding the sleeping household safely while the gardens outside whispered their secrets to the night wind. This was just the beginning of Eleanor's summer at Willowbrook Manor, the first night of what would prove to be a transformative season of discovery and growth. But for now, she was content to sleep peacefully in the rose room, surrounded by the gentle sounds and scents of the English countryside, while the moon cast silver light over the gardens and the night air carried the promise of adventures yet to come. The secret of the moonlit garden lander woke to the gentle sound of birdsong drifting through her open windows. For a moment, she lay still in the comfortable bed, listening to the melodic chorus of robins and larks and finches welcoming the dawn. Soft, golden light filtered through the rose-patterned curtains, and she could smell the sweet fragrance of morning flowers carried on the gentle breeze. The air was fresh and clean, so different from the sooty atmosphere of London, and she breathed deeply, feeling her lungs fill with the pure country air rising from her bed. Eleanor padded barefoot across the soft carpet to the windows. She pushed aside the curtains and looked out at the gardens of Willowbrook Manor, seeing them clearly for the first time in the morning light. The sight took her breath away. The formal gardens spread out below her window like a living tapestry, with geometric patterns of flowers and herbs, creating intricate designs in shades of pink and purple and white. Box hedges had been trimmed into perfect edges, and gravel pathways wound between the beds in graceful curves. Beyond the formal gardens, Eleanor could see wilder areas where trees and shrubs grew in more natural arrangements. There was a small stream that sparkled in the morning sunlight, crossed by the stone bridge she had glimpsed from the carriage the night before. Water lilies floated on the surface of a pond, and she could see the flash of goldfish moving in the clear water. Somewhere among the trees, she caught a glimpse of what looked like a small stone temple or folly, its columns draped with climbing roses. A soft knock at her door interrupted her contemplation. Mrs. Pemberton appeared with a tray of morning tea and fresh rolls, her round face beaming with pleasure. "Good morning, Miss Eleanor," the housekeeper said, setting the tray on the small table by the window. "I thought you might like some tea to start your day. Miss Cordelia is already up and about in the gardens as usual. She asked me to tell you that she be in the herb garden when you're ready to join her." Eleanor accepted the tea gratefully, inhaling the fragrant steam that rose from the delicate porcelain cup. The tea was a blend she didn't recognize, with hints of mint and chamomile that seemed to complement the peaceful morning atmosphere perfectly. "What time is it?" Eleanor asked, realizing she had no idea how long she had slept. "Just past 7. Mrs. Pemberton replied. "You've had a good long rest. Miss Cordelia always says that the country air helps people sleep better than any medicine." After Mrs. Pemberton left, Eleanor dressed quickly in a simple day dress of pale blue cotton that would be suitable for walking in the gardens. She chose sturdy boots and a wide-brimmed hat to protect her from the sun, then made her way downstairs and out into the morning air. The gardens were even more beautiful up close than they had appeared from her window. The morning dew still clung to the flower petals, making them sparkle like diamonds in the sunlight. Bees hummed contentedly among the lavender bushes, and butterflies danced from flower to flower in a graceful ballet. The air was filled with the mingled fragrances of roses and jasmine, mint and rosemary, and dozens of other plants that Eleanor couldn't yet identify. She found Aunt Cordelia exactly where Mrs. Pemberton had said she would be, kneeling among the herbs with her hands buried in the rich, dark soil. Cordelia was wearing a simple work dress of brown cotton and a broad-brimmed hat that had seen many seasons in the garden. Her sleeves were rolled up to her elbows, and there was a smudge of earth on her cheek, but she looked completely content and at peace. "Good morning, my dear," Cordelia said, looking up with a smile that seemed to reflect the brightness of the morning sun. "I hope you slept well. Isn't it a glorious day? The plants are practically singing with joy." Eleanor laughed, delighted by her aunt's obvious happiness. "I slept wonderfully, thank you. And you're right about the day. It's absolutely perfect. What are you working on?" Cordelia gestured to the bed of herbs around her. "I'm harvesting some of the medicinal plants for drying. This time of year, when the morning dew has just evaporated, but the sun isn't yet too hot, it's the perfect time to gather herbs for winter storage. Would you like to help? I can teach you about the different plants and their uses." Eleanor knelt beside her aunt, eager to learn. Cordelia began pointing out the various herbs and explaining their properties. There was chamomile for soothing nerves and helping with sleep, lavender for its calming properties and lovely scent, mint for digestive ailments, and rosemary for improving memory and concentration. Each plant had its own story and its own place. In the carefully planned garden, my grandmother started this herb garden more than 50 years ago, Cordelia explained as they worked. She was known throughout the county for her knowledge of medicinal plants. People would come from miles around seeking her advice for various ailments. I learned everything I know from her, and someday I hope to pass that knowledge on to someone else who shares our passion for the healing power of plants. As they worked side by side, Eleanor found herself completely absorbed in the task. There was something deeply satisfying about working with her hands in the soil, about learning to identify plants by their leaves and flowers and scents. Cordelia was a patient teacher, showing Eleanor how to harvest the herbs at just the right time, how to handle them gently to preserve their essential oils, and how to bunch them properly for drying. The morning passed quickly, and by the time they had finished their work, Eleanor felt as if she had learned more about plants than she had in all her years of formal education. They carried their harvest to a small outbuilding behind the manor, where bundles of herbs hung from the rafters in neat rows. The air in the drying shed was filled with the concentrated fragrances of dozens of different plants, creating an almost intoxicating blend of scents. This is where we store the dried herbs for winter use, Cordelia explained, hanging up there. Morning's work. Some we use for cooking, others for making teas and tinctures. In the winter months, when the gardens are dormant, these dried plants help us remember the abundance of summer. After they had finished in the drying shed, Cordelia suggested they take a proper tour of the gardens. Eleanor was eager to see more of the estate, and they spent the next few hours wandering through the various areas, each one more beautiful than the last. They visited the rose garden, where hundreds of varieties bloomed in a riot of colors and fragrances. There were ancient varieties with names like Maiden's Blush and Apothecary's Rose, as well as newer hybrids that had been developed by plant breeders in recent years. Cordelia knew the history of each variety, telling Eleanor stories about how they had been acquired and which family members had planted them. From the rose garden, they moved to the water garden, where lily ponds reflected the sky like mirrors, and a small waterfall created a gentle, soothing sound. Goldfish swam lazily in the clear water, and dragonflies hovered over the surface, their wings catching the sunlight like fragments of stained glass. Water lilies bloomed in shades of white and pink and yellow, their petals floating on the surface like offerings to the sky. The woodland garden was perhaps Eleanor's favorite area. Here, ancient trees created a natural cathedral, their branches forming a canopy high overhead. Woodland flowers bloomed in the dappled shade, wild roses and foxgloves, bluebells and ferns. A narrow stream meandered through the area, its banks lined with moss and wildflowers. The air was cooler here and filled with the earthy scent of rich soil and decomposing leaves. This is where I come when I need to think, Cordelia said softly as they walked along the stream. There's something about being among the trees that helps put everything in perspective. The ancient oaks have seen so much. Generations of our family changes in the world beyond these walls. They remind me that we're part of something much larger than ourselves. As they walked, Eleanor noticed that there were many paths winding through the gardens, some paved with stone, others simply worn tracks through the grass. Some led to specific destinations, like the various garden areas or the small temple she had glimpsed from her window. Others seemed to wander without purpose, inviting exploration and discovery. There are paths everywhere, Eleanor observed. Do they all lead somewhere specific? Cordelia smiled mysteriously. Some do, some don't. That's part of the magic of Willowbrook. The gardens have been growing and changing for so long that they've developed their own personality. Sometimes a path will lead you exactly where you intended to go, and sometimes it will take you somewhere completely unexpected. The key is to trust the garden and let it guide you. They stopped for lunch in a small gazebo that overlooked the formal gardens. Mrs. Pemberton had packed a basket with fresh bread, cheese, and fruit, along with a thermos of tea brewed from herbs they had harvested that morning. As they ate, Eleanor found herself asking her aunt about the history of the estate and the family who had lived here for so many generations. Each generation has left its mark on Willowbrook, Cordelia explained. My great-grandfather built the original manor house and laid out the formal gardens. His son, my grandfather, added the water gardens and planted many of the trees in the woodland area. My father created the rose garden, and my grandmother, as I mentioned, developed the herb garden into what it is today. And what have you added, Eleanor asked. Cordelia's eyes took on a dreamy quality. I've been working on something special for the past several years. A garden that can only be seen and experienced at night when the moon is full. It's not finished yet, but perhaps tonight, if you're interested, I could show you what I've accomplished so far. Eleanor's curiosity was immediately piqued. A garden that can only be seen at night. How is that possible? Ah, Cordelia said with a gentle smile. That's the secret. You'll have to wait until tonight to find out. But I will say this, it's been a labor of love, and I think it captures something essential about the magic of Willowbrook. The afternoon was spent exploring more of the estate. They visited the kitchen garden, where vegetables grew in neat rows and fruit trees were heavy, with the promise of the harvest to come. There was a greenhouse where exotic plants from around the world were carefully tended, and a small library housed in one of the outbuildings. Its shelves lined with books on botany, horticulture, and natural history. As evening approached, they made their way back to the manor house. Eleanor was tired but exhilarated from her day of exploration. She had learned so much about plants and gardening, about the history of the estate and her family's connection to the land. But more than that, she had felt a deep sense of connection to the place itself, as if the gardens were welcoming her home. Dinner was another pleasant affair, with fresh vegetables from the garden and herbs that added complex flavors to every dish. Eleanor found herself eating with more appetite than she had in months. The combination of fresh air and physical activity having awakened her senses in ways she hadn't expected as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Cordelia suggested they take a walk through the formal gardens to watch the transition from day to night. Eleanor agreed eagerly, curious to see how the gardens would look in the twilight. The transformation was remarkable. As the daylight faded, the gardens took on a completely different character. Colors that had been bright and vivid in the sunlight became muted and mysterious. The white flowers seemed to glow with their own inner light, and the fragrances of night-blooming plants began to perfume the air. Somewhere in the distance, a nightingale began its evening song. Pats emerged from their daytime roosts to begin their nightly hunt for insects. This is when the magic really begins, Cordelia said softly as they walked along one of the gravel paths. The gardens are beautiful during the day, but at night they become something else entirely. It's as if they reveal their true nature when the sun goes down. As full darkness settled over the estate, Cordelia led Eleanor toward a part of the gardens she hadn't seen before. They walked along a path that seemed to wind through a grove of trees, their footsteps muffled by the soft earth. The path was lit by small lanterns that cast gentle pools of light, creating an atmosphere of mystery and enchantment. "Where are we going?" Eleanor asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Something about the nighttime garden seemed to call for quiet reverence. "To the moonlit garden," Cordelia replied. "My special project. I've been working on it for 5 years now, and it's finally ready to be shared." They emerged from the grove of trees into a circular clearing that took Eleanor's breath away. The moonlit garden was unlike anything she had ever seen or imagined. The entire space was planted with flowers that bloomed only at night or showed their true beauty in moonlight. White flowers seemed to glow with their own inner radiance, jasmine and moonflowers, white roses and night-blooming cereus. The air was filled with the most incredible fragrances, sweet and exotic and utterly intoxicating. In the center of the garden was a small fountain, its water catching the moonlight and sending sparkles of silver light dancing across the white flowers. Stone benches were placed strategically around the space, inviting visitors to sit and absorb the magical atmosphere. The entire garden was enclosed by a hedge of white-flowering shrubs, creating a sense of intimacy and seclusion. "It's absolutely incredible," Eleanor breathed, turning slowly to take in every detail. "I've never seen anything like it. It's like a garden from a fairy tale." Cordelia beamed with pleasure at her niece's reaction. "I wanted to create a space that would capture the magic of moonlight and night-blooming flowers. Has been chosen for its beauty in moonlight or its fragrance in the cool night air. Some of the flowers only open at night. Others are more fragrant after dark. The fountain provides the sound of running water, which seems to enhance the fragrances and create a sense of peace and tranquility." They sat on one of the stone benches, and Eleanor found herself completely enchanted by the experience. The combination of the moonlight, the fragrances, and the gentle sound of the fountain created an atmosphere of profound peace and beauty. It was as if they had stepped into another world, a place where time moved differently and magic was not only possible but inevitable. "How did you know to plant all these flowers together?" Eleanor asked. "How did you know they would create such a beautiful effect?" Cordelia smiled. "Years of observation and experimentation. I studied which plants bloomed at night, which ones were most fragrant in the cool air, which ones would look most beautiful in moonlight. I visited other gardens and read books about night-blooming plants, but mostly I trusted my instincts and let the garden guide me." As they sat in the moonlit garden, Eleanor felt a profound sense of connection, not only to the place, but to something deeper within herself. The beauty of the garden seemed to awaken feelings and sensations she had never experienced before. It was as if the moonlight and the fragrances were speaking directly to her soul, telling her things she had always known but never been able to put into words. "I feel different here," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the gentle splash of the fountain. "As if this place is showing me who I really am, or who I could become." The moonlit garden has that effect on people. There's something about the combination of moonlight and night-blooming flowers that seems to open the heart and quiet the mind. I've spent many hours here myself, especially when I needed to make difficult decisions or when I was feeling lost or uncertain. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. A gentle breeze stirred the leaves of the trees surrounding the garden, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called out its haunting song. The fountain continued its gentle music and the fragrances of the night-blooming flowers seemed to grow, stronger and more complex as the night deepened. "And Cordelia," Eleanor said finally, "may I ask you something personal?" "Of course, my dear. What is it? Why did you never marry?" "I know it's not really my place to ask, but I've always wondered. You're so wise and kind, and you've created such beauty here. I can't imagine that you didn't have opportunities." Cordelia was quiet for a long moment, her face thoughtful in the moonlight. When she spoke, her voice was gentle and without any trace of sadness or regret. "I did have opportunities," she said. "There was a young man many years ago who asked for my hand in marriage. He was kind and intelligent and would have made a good husband. But when I thought about leaving Willowbrook to live in his household, about giving up my gardens and my independence, I realized I couldn't do it. The life I had built here, the connection I felt to the land and the plants, was too important to give up." She paused, looking around the moonlit garden with obvious affection. "I suppose some people would say I chose solitude over love, but I don't see it that way. I chose a different kind of love. Love for this place, for the work I do here, for the peace and fulfillment I find in creating beauty and helping things grow. It's been a good life, Eleanor. A full life." Eleanor nodded, understanding more than she had expected to. "I think I know what you mean. Sometimes I feel like there's a part of me that can only be satisfied by, I don't know how to put by being connected to something larger than myself. In London, I feel cut off from that connection. But here, in the gardens, I feel like I'm coming alive." "That's exactly it," Cordelia said, reaching over to squeeze Eleanor's hand. "That connection to something larger than ourselves, that's what the gardens teach us. Every flower that blooms, every tree that grows, every season that passes reminds us that we're part of an incredible web of life. When we learn to work with that web instead of against it, when we learn to listen to what the natural world is telling us, we find a kind of peace and purpose that nothing else can provide." They remained in the moonlit garden for another hour, talking softly about life and love and the choices that shape our destinies. Eleanor found herself sharing thoughts and feelings she had never expressed to anyone before. And Cordelia listened with the patient attention of someone who truly understood. As the night grew cooler and the moon reached its zenith, they finally made their way back to the manor house. The windows glowed warmly in the darkness, and Eleanor could see Mrs. Pemberton moving about inside, preparing the house for the night. The contrast between the wild beauty of the moonlit garden and the civilized comfort of the manor, struck her as perfect. Here was a place where the natural world and human culture existed in perfect harmony. "Thank you for showing me the moonlit garden," Eleanor said as they reached the front door. "I've ever seen. I feel like it's changed something in me, though I'm not sure I can say exactly what." Cordelia smiled and gave her a gentle hug. "That's exactly how I felt the first time I sat in a moonlit garden. You'll understand more as time goes on, I think." Eleanor climbed the stairs to her room, her mind still filled with images of the moonlit garden and the profound conversation she had shared with her aunt. She prepared for bed, slowly, savoring the memory of the evening and trying to capture in her mind every detail of the magical garden. From her window, she could see the soft glow of the moonlit garden in the distance, like a beacon in the darkness. The sight filled her with a sense of peace and anticipation. Tomorrow would bring new discoveries, new conversations, new insights into the mysteries of Willowbrook Manor and the gardens that had become such an important part of her family's history. As she settled into bed, Eleanor found herself thinking about her aunt's words about connection and purpose. She had always felt that there was something missing in her life, some element that would make everything make sense. Tonight, sitting in the moonlit garden, she had felt closer to understanding what that missing element might be. It had something to do with the natural world, with the cycle of seasons and the patient work of creating beauty, with the deep satisfaction that came from nurturing growing things. The moon cast silver light through her windows. Tay and she could hear the gentle sounds of the night garden, the splash of the fountain, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, the distant call of a night bird. These sounds seemed to blend together into a lullaby that spoke of peace and contentment, of the eternal rhythm of growth and rest that governed all living things. Eleanor's eyes grew heavy, and she felt herself drifting toward sleep. Her dreams were filled with images of the moonlit garden, of flowers that glowed with their own inner light, of pathways that led to secret places where ancient wisdom waited to be discovered. She dreamed of herself as an old woman, tending gardens with the same loving care that Aunt Cordelia showed, passing on the knowledge and the passion to another generation in her dreams. She understood perfectly what her aunt had meant about choosing a different kind of love. It wasn't about rejecting human connection, but about finding a deeper connection to the world itself, to the forces that created beauty and sustained life. It was about becoming part of something larger and more enduring than any single human. Life about contributing to a legacy of beauty and wisdom that would continue long after she was gone. The moon continued its journey across the sky, casting its silver light over the gardens of Willowbrook Manor. In the moonlit garden, the night-blooming flowers continued their quiet display, their fragrances perfuming the air, and their beauty offering solace to any who might wander into their magical circle. The fountain continued its gentle music, and the stone benches waited patiently for the next visitor who might need the garden's particular brand of healing dot in the rose room. Eleanor slept peacefully, her dreams filled with moonlight and flowers, with the promise of summer days ahead and the deep satisfaction of work that fed the soul. The manor house held her safely, as it had held generations of her family before her, while outside the gardens continued their eternal dance, with the seasons offering their gifts of beauty and wisdom to all who were wise enough to receive them. The language of flowers. Eleanor woke the next morning to the sound of gentle rain pattering against her windows. Instead of feeling disappointed by the gray skies, she found herself oddly comforted by the soft, rhythmic sound. The rain seemed to wrap the manor in a cocoon of peace, and she could smell the sweet scent of earth and growing things that rose from the wet garden. She dressed in a warm wool dress and made her way downstairs, where she found Aunt Cordelia in the morning room, seated at a small writing desk with papers and books spread out before her. The older woman looked up with a smile as Eleanor entered and gestured to a chair by the window. "Good morning, dear one," Cordelia said, her voice as gentle as the rain outside. "I hope the weather doesn't disappoint you. Rainy days have their own particular charm, and they're perfect for certain kinds of work." Eleanor settled into the comfortable chair and accepted the cup of tea that Mrs. Pemberton brought her. "What kind of work?" she asked, curious about what her aunt might have planned for the day. Cordelia's eyes sparkled with anticipation. "I thought today might be the perfect time to introduce you to the language of flowers. It's something I've been studying for years, and I think you might find it fascinating." She gestured to the books and papers on her desk. Throughout history, people have assigned meanings to different flowers and plants. Sometimes these meanings were based on the plant's appearance, sometimes on its medicinal properties, sometimes on myths and legends associated with it. During certain periods, especially in recent decades, the language of flowers became quite elaborate. People could send entire messages using carefully chosen bouquets. Eleanor leaned forward, intrigued. "You mean people could have conversations using flowers instead of words?" "Exactly," Cordelia said, obviously pleased by her niece's interest. "A red rose might mean passionate love, while a yellow rose could signify friendship. White roses often represented purity or new beginnings. But it went far beyond roses. Every flower, every herb, every tree had its own meaning. Even the way flowers were presented could change their meaning. A bouquet given upside down might reverse the message entirely. Cordelia rose from her desk and moved to a bookshelf lined with volumes on botany and horticulture. She pulled out a well-worn leather book and brought it to Eleanor. "This is my flower dictionary," she said, opening the book to reveal pages filled with detailed drawings of plants and their associated meanings. "I've been adding to it for years, collecting information from various sources and recording my own observations." Eleanor examined the book with fascination. Each page contained beautiful illustrations of flowers and plants, accompanied by careful notes in Cordelia's elegant handwriting. She saw that roses were indeed included, but so were dozens of other plants she was beginning to recognize from her explorations of the gardens. "Look at this," Cordelia said, pointing to a page featuring a delicate illustration of lavender. Lavender traditionally represents devotion and serenity, but it can also mean distrust if given in certain circumstances. The context and the giver's intent are just as important as the flower itself. They spent the morning going through the book together, with Cordelia explaining the various meanings and their historical origins. Eleanor learned that daisies represented innocence and purity, that forget-me-nots meant true love and remembrance, that rosemary was for remembrance and fidelity. Some of the meanings seemed obvious when explained, while others were more mysterious and complex. Why did people develop such an elaborate system? Eleanor asked as they paused for more tea. Why not just use words? Cordelia smiled. Sometimes words aren't enough, or they're not safe to use. During certain periods of history, people needed to communicate feelings and ideas that couldn't be expressed openly. A young woman might not be able to tell a young man directly that she cared for him, but she could send him a bouquet that conveyed her feelings. Political dissidents could send messages of resistance using flowers that seemed innocent to casual observers. She paused, looking out at the rain-soaked garden. But I think there's something deeper at work as well. Flowers speak to us in ways that words sometimes can't. They touch our emotions and our senses directly. You don't just see the flower, you smell its fragrance, feel the softness of its petals, perhaps even prick your finger on its thorns. The entire experience conveys meaning in a way that words alone cannot. As the morning progressed, Eleanor found herself completely absorbed in learning about the language of flowers. Cordelia was a gifted teacher, weaving together botany, history, and human psychology in ways that made each plant's meaning feel both logical and magical. They discussed how different cultures had developed their own flower languages, how meanings had evolved over time, and how the same flower could convey different messages depending on its color. its stage of bloom, and the circumstances of its giving. I'd like to teach you to create your own flower messages, Cordelia said, as they finished their tea. The rain has stopped, and I think the garden will be perfect for gathering flowers. We can practice the language by creating bouquets that tell stories or convey specific meanings. Eleanor agreed eagerly, and they made their way out into the garden. The rain had indeed stopped, and the afternoon sun was beginning to break through the clouds. The garden looked refreshed and vibrant, with water droplets clinging to every leaf and petal like tiny jewels. The air was filled with the rich scent of wet earth and growing things, and Eleanor could hear birds beginning to sing again as the weather cleared. They walked through the various garden areas, with Cordelia pointing out different plants and reminding Eleanor of their meanings. In the herb garden, they found chamomile for patience and courage, mint for warmth of feeling, and thyme for courage and strength. The rose garden offered a full spectrum of meanings, depending on the color and variety of the roses they chose.
Let's
Start with something simple, Cordelia suggested. Try creating a small bouquet that expresses welcome and friendship. Think about what flowers would convey those feelings most effectively. Eleanor considered carefully, then began gathering flowers that seemed appropriate. She chose yellow roses for friendship, white daisies for innocence and new beginnings, and sprigs of rosemary for remembrance. She added some mint for warmth of feeling, and a few stems of lavender for their soothing properties. Cordelia examined the bouquet with approval. "Excellent choices," she said. "This would indeed convey a warm welcome and the beginning of a new friendship. The combination of flowers creates a message that is both clear and complex. You're not just saying, 'Welcome.' You're saying, 'I welcome you as a friend and hope this will be the beginning of something lasting and meaningful.'" They spent the afternoon creating various bouquets, each one designed to convey a specific message or emotion. Eleanor created arrangements that spoke of gratitude, hope, remembrance, and joy. With each bouquet, she found herself thinking more deeply about the relationships between colors, scents, and meanings, and how the careful selection and arrangement of flowers could indeed function as a sophisticated form of communication. "There's something almost magical about this," Eleanor said as she worked on a bouquet meant to convey peaceful contentment. "It's as if the flowers are teaching me their own language, showing me how to use them to express things I might not be able to say with words." Cordelia nodded knowingly. "That's exactly how I felt when I first began studying the language of flowers. It's not just about memorizing meanings. It's about developing a relationship with the plants themselves, learning to understand their essential nature and how that nature can be used to communicate human emotions and ideas." As the afternoon wore on, Eleanor found herself developing an almost intuitive understanding of how different flowers work together to create meaning. She learned that the language of flowers was not rigid or absolute, but rather a fluid and creative form of expression that could be adapted to individual circumstances and personal interpretations. The most important thing, Cordelia explained as they arranged their final bouquet of the day, is to trust your instincts and allow the flowers to guide you. The traditional meanings are important to know, but they're just a starting point. The real art lies in understanding how to combine flowers in ways that create new and deeper meanings. They carried their bouquets back to the manor house, where Mrs. Pemberton exclaimed with delight over their creations. The housekeeper arranged them in vases throughout the house, and Eleanor was amazed at how the carefully chosen flowers seemed to transform the atmosphere of each room. The welcome bouquet in the front hall made the space feel more inviting, while the arrangement meant to convey peaceful contentment brought a sense of serenity to the drawing room. After dinner, they sat in the library, surrounded by books on botany and horticulture. Cordelia had brought out several more volumes on the language of flowers, and Eleanor found herself fascinated by the different interpretations and systems that had developed over the centuries. In the Victorian era, Cordelia explained, the language of flowers became incredibly elaborate. There were entire dictionaries devoted to flower meanings, and people would spend hours crafting bouquets that told complex stories or conveyed subtle emotions. A single bouquet might contain dozens of different flowers, each one chosen for its specific meaning and its relationship to the others. Eleanor examined a Victorian flower dictionary, marveling at the complexity of the system. It must have taken years to learn all of these meanings, she said. How did people remember them all? Practice and passion, Cordelia replied. When something truly interests you, when it speaks to your soul, you find ways to master it. And I think the people who became fluent in the language of flowers were those who felt a deep connection to the natural world, who understood that plants and flowers have their own wisdom to offer. As the evening progressed, Eleanor found herself thinking about the deeper implications of the language of flowers. It wasn't just a quaint historical curiosity. It represented a way of understanding and communicating with the natural world that had been largely lost in modern times. In a world that was becoming increasingly mechanized and urban, the ability to speak with flowers offered a connection to something ancient and essential. Do you think people still use the language of flowers today? Eleanor asked as they prepared. To close the books for the evening, Cordelia smiled. I believe they do, though perhaps not as consciously as in the past, when someone gives red roses to express love, or when they bring flowers to a funeral to convey sympathy. They're using the language of flowers, whether they realize it or not. The meanings are still there, still understood at some level, even if people don't think about them explicitly. She paused, looking thoughtful. I also believe that the flowers themselves continue to speak to us, continue to offer their wisdom and their beauty, regardless of whether we understand their traditional meanings. The language of flowers is really about learning to listen to what the natural world is telling us, and that conversation never stops. As Eleanor prepared for bed that night, she found herself thinking about all she had learned about the language of flowers. It seemed to her that this ancient form of communication offered something that modern life was missing. A way of expressing subtle emotions and complex ideas through beauty rather than through words alone. From her window, she could see the gardens spread out in the moonlight, and she imagined that she could almost hear the flowers whispering to each other in their ancient language. The roses in the formal garden were sharing stories of love and beauty, while the herbs in the kitchen garden were discussing their healing properties and their service to human health. The wildflowers in the meadow were singing songs of freedom and natural joy, while the ancient trees were sharing the wisdom of centuries. The idea that she could learn to participate in this conversation, to understand and use the language of flowers to express her own deepest feelings and insights, filled Eleanor with excitement and anticipation. She felt as if she had discovered a secret door to a world she had always sensed but never been able to enter. As she drifted toward sleep, Eleanor dreamed of gardens where flowers spoke in voices she could understand, where every bloom carried a message of love or hope or wisdom. She dreamed of herself as a master of the flower language, able to create bouquets that could heal broken hearts, inspire courage in the fearful, and bring comfort to the grieving. She dreamed of a world where the ancient conversation between humans and plants continued unbroken, where the wisdom of the natural world was cherished and preserved for future generations. The moon shone down on the gardens of Willowbrook Manor, illuminating the countless flowers that grew there. In the language of flowers, the garden itself was a vast and complex message, a story told in petals and leaves and stems. It spoke of generations of love and care, of the patient work of creating beauty, of the deep satisfaction that comes from living in harmony with the natural world. And in the rose room, Eleanor slept peacefully, her dreams filled with flowers and their ancient wisdom, while outside the garden continued its eternal conversation with the moon and the stars, speaking in the language that had existed since the beginning of time, when the first flower opened its petals to the sun and offered its beauty to the world. The wisdom of seasons. Eleanor woke to find the world outside her window transformed by a heavy morning mist. The gardens of Willowbrook Manor seemed to float in a sea of silver vapor, with only the tops of the tallest trees visible above the ethereal blanket. The effect was utterly magical, as if the manor existed in some enchanted realm between earth and sky. She dressed quickly and made her way downstairs, eager to experience the mysterious beauty of the mist-shrouded gardens. She found Aunt Cordelia in the conservatory, a glass-walled room that extended from the back of the manor house. The space was filled with exotic plants from around the world, their leaves and flowers creating a tropical paradise in the heart of the English countryside. The air was warm and humid, fragrant with the scent of jasmine and orchids and dozens of other flowering plants Eleanor couldn't identify. "Good morning, dear one," Cordelia said, looking up from where she was tending a collection of delicate ferns. "Isn't the mist magnificent? Days like this remind me why I love the changing seasons so much. Each one brings its own particular beauty and its own lessons." Eleanor moved to the conservatory windows and peered out at the mist-trapped gardens. "It's like being inside a cloud," she said softly. "Everything looks so mysterious and dreamlike." "That's exactly right," Cordelia agreed, joining her at the window. "The mist has a way of transforming the familiar into the mysterious. It reminds us that there's always more to see and understand than what appears on the surface." They spent the morning in the conservatory, with Cordelia teaching Eleanor about the exotic plants that couldn't survive in the English climate without protection. There were orchids from tropical rainforests, cacti from desert regions, and delicate flowers from mountain meadows around the world. Each plant had its own story and its own particular needs, and Cordelia knew them all as if they were old friends. Creating a proper conservatory is about more than just collecting interesting plants, Cordelia explained as they worked. It's about understanding the relationships between different species, about creating microclimates that allow diverse plants to thrive together. It's a lesson in cooperation and harmony that applies to much more than just gardening. As the morning progressed, the mist began to lift, revealing the gardens in stages like a slowly drawn curtain. First, the formal gardens emerged, their geometric patterns sharp and clear in the brightening light. Then the rose garden became visible, its blooms heavy with dew and more beautiful than ever. Finally, the woodland areas and distant meadows appeared, completing the picture of Willowbrook Manor's extensive grounds. "I want to show you something special today," Cordelia said as they finished their work in the conservatory. "There's a place in the gardens where the changing seasons are particularly evident, where you can see the cycle of life and death and rebirth that governs all living things. I think you're ready to understand its lesson." They made their way through the gardens following paths that Eleanor was beginning to know by heart. The morning air was fresh and clean after the mist, and the plants seemed to sparkle with renewed vitality. Birds sang in the trees, and Eleanor could hear the gentle hum of bees going about their work among the flowers. Cordelia led her to a part of the estate she hadn't visited before, where a small hill rose above the surrounding landscape. At the top of the hill stood a grove of ancient trees, their trunks massive and their branches spreading wide. As they climbed the winding path to the summit, Eleanor noticed that the trees were of different species and ages, creating a complex ecosystem that seemed to exist in its own world. "This is the sacred grove," Cordelia said as they reached the top of the hill. "It's been here since long before the manor was built, and each generation of our family has added to it and cared for it. It's a place where you can see the full cycle of the seasons, where the wisdom of time and change is made visible." Eleanor looked around the grove with wonder. There were oak trees that must have been hundreds of years old, their trunks so massive that several people would have been needed to encircle them with their arms. Younger trees grew in the spaces between the ancient giants, and she could see saplings just beginning their journey toward the sky. The forest floor was covered with a thick carpet of fallen leaves, and she could see the remains of trees that had fallen years ago, now serving as nurse logs for new growth. Every season brings changes to the grove, Cordelia explained as they walked among the trees. In spring, the trees burst into leaf, and the forest floor comes alive with wildflowers. Summer brings deep shade and the rich green of full growth. Autumn turns the leaves to gold and crimson, and winter strips the trees bare, revealing their essential structure and strength. She paused beside one of the ancient oaks, placing her hand on its deeply grooved bark. But the real lesson of the grove is about the cycle of life and death and rebirth that governs all living things. See how the fallen trees become soil for new growth, how the leaves that drop each autumn decompose and feed the roots of the living trees. Nothing is ever truly lost. It all becomes part of the continuing cycle. Eleanor felt a profound sense of peace settle over her as she absorbed the wisdom of the grove. She could see what her aunt meant about the cycle of life and death and rebirth. The grove was a living demonstration of how endings became beginnings, how death fed life, how the passage of time brought not loss but transformation. "I've always been afraid of change," Eleanor admitted as they sat on a fallen log that had been worn smooth by years of weather and use. In London, everything seems to change so quickly, and usually not for the better. But here, in the grove, change seems peaceful somehow, natural. That's because the changes here are part of a natural cycle that has been going on for thousands of years. The trees don't resist the changing seasons, they flow with them, finding their own way to thrive in each different condition. Spring brings new growth. Summer brings abundance. Autumn brings harvest and preparation. Winter brings rest and renewal. She gestured to the grove around them. Each season has its own beauty and its own purpose. Spring is about possibility and new beginnings. Summer is about growth and abundance. Autumn is about harvest and preparation. Winter is about rest and reflection. If we try to resist these natural cycles, we create suffering for ourselves. But if we learn to flow with them, to find our own way to thrive in each season, we discover a deeper kind of happiness and fulfillment. They spent the rest of the morning in the grove, with Cordelia teaching Eleanor to identify the different trees and understand their roles in the forest ecosystem. She learned about the oak trees that provided acorns for wildlife, the ash trees with their distinctive compound leaves, the beech trees with their smooth gray bark and edible nuts. Each species had its own particular characteristics and its own way of contributing to the health of the forest. The grove teaches us about community as well as about cycles. Cordelia explained as they examined a young sapling growing in the rich soil at the base of an ancient oak. The trees don't compete with each other, they cooperate. The large trees provide shelter for the smaller ones, and the smaller trees contribute to the overall health of the forest. They share resources through their root systems, and they communicate with each other through chemical signals. Eleanor found this idea fascinating. Trees communicate with each other. How? Through their roots and through the air, Cordelia replied. They can send chemical signals that warn of insect attacks or disease, and they can share nutrients through underground fungal networks. The forest is really one large, interconnected organism, with each tree playing its part in the health of the whole. As the afternoon wore on, Eleanor found herself developing a deeper appreciation for the complexity and wisdom of the natural world. The grove was like a living library, filled with lessons about cooperation, adaptation, and the beauty of natural cycles. She began to understand why her aunt had chosen to spend her life in harmony with the natural world rather than in the artificial environment of human society. I'm beginning to understand why you love it here so much, Eleanor said, as they prepared to leave the grove. There's a peace here that I've never found anywhere else. A sense of being part of something larger and more meaningful than myself. Cordelia smiled with obvious pleasure. That's exactly what I hoped you would discover. The natural world has so much to teach us about how to live, how to find meaning and purpose and joy. The key is learning to listen, to observe, to let the wisdom of the earth guide us. They made their way back down the hill as the afternoon sun began to cast long shadows across the gardens. The mist had completely cleared, and the landscape was bathed in golden light that seemed to make every leaf and flower glow from within. Eleanor felt a profound sense of gratitude for the day's experiences and for the wisdom her aunt was sharing with her. That evening, they dined in the small dining room again, surrounded by the bouquets they had created the day before. The flowers seemed to tell their own stories in the candlelight, and Eleanor found herself reading their messages with growing confidence. The welcome bouquet spoke of friendship and new beginnings, while the arrangement meant to convey peaceful contentment seemed to embody the very essence of their day in the grove. After dinner, they sat in the library, surrounded by books on natural history and philosophy. Cordelia had pulled out several volumes on the wisdom traditions of various cultures, and Eleanor was fascinated to learn how many different societies had developed similar insights about the importance of living in harmony with natural cycles. Ancient peoples understood things that we seem to have forgotten, Cordelia said as they examined a book on Celtic tree wisdom. They knew that the earth itself was a teacher, that the cycles of the seasons carried lessons about how to live. They celebrated the changes in the natural world and found ways to align their own lives with those changes. Eleanor studied the illustrations in the book, which showed how different trees were associated with different qualities and seasons. Do you think it's possible to live this way in the modern world, to really align ourselves with natural cycles? I believe it is, Cordelia replied thoughtfully. It requires a different way of thinking, a different set of priorities. Instead of trying to control and dominate the natural world, we learn to work with it. Instead of fighting against the cycles of change, we learn to flow with them. Instead of seeking constant growth and accumulation, we learn to appreciate the rhythms of expansion and contraction, activity and rest. She paused, looking out the window at the gardens bathed in moonlight. It's not always easy, especially in a world that seems to value speed and efficiency over wisdom and harmony. But I believe it's possible, and I believe it's necessary if we want to find true fulfillment and peace. As the evening progressed, Eleanor found herself thinking about how she might apply the lessons of the grove to her own life. She thought about the cycles of her own energy and mood, about the seasons of her own growth and development. She began to see how fighting against these natural rhythms created much of the restlessness and dissatisfaction she had felt in London. I think I've been trying to live in permanent summer, she said suddenly, the insight coming to her like a flash of light. Always trying to be productive, always trying to grow and achieve. But maybe I need to learn to embrace the other seasons, too. The rest of winter, the new beginnings of spring, the harvest of autumn. Cordelia smiled with obvious delight. That's a profound insight, dear one. Most people do try to live in permanent summer, and then they wonder why they feel exhausted and depleted. Learning to honor all the seasons, both in the natural world and in our own lives, is one of the greatest gifts we can give ourselves. As they prepared to retire for the evening, Eleanor felt a deep sense of gratitude for the day's experiences and revelations. The grove had taught her something essential about the nature of time and change, about the wisdom of cycles and the beauty of natural rhythms. She felt as if she had been given a new lens through which to view her life and her choices. From her window that night, she could see the grove on its hilltop, the ancient trees silhouetted against the star-filled sky. The sight filled her with a sense of peace and continuity, a reminder that she was part of something much larger and more enduring than her individual concerns and worries. As she settled into bed, Eleanor found herself thinking about the seasons of her own life. She was still young, still in the spring of her existence, with so many possibilities ahead of her. But she was beginning to understand that each season would bring its own gifts and its own lessons, its own beauty and its own purpose. The key was learning to embrace each season fully, to find ways to thrive in whatever conditions life presented. Her dreams that night were filled with images of the grove through the seasons. She saw the trees in spring, their new leaves unfurling in the warm sunshine. She saw them in summer, their full canopies providing shade and shelter for countless creatures. She saw them in autumn, their leaves turning brilliant colors before falling to the forest floor. And she saw them in winter, their bare branches reaching toward the sky in stark beauty, their roots drawing strength from the earth for the next cycle of growth. In her dreams, she understood that she was part of this eternal cycle, that her own life was connected to the great wheel of the seasons and the ancient wisdom of the earth. She felt a profound sense of belonging, of being exactly where she was meant to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do. The grove had given her a gift that would last for the rest of her life, the understanding that change was not something to be feared, but something to be embraced as part of the natural order of things. The moon continued its journey across the sky, casting silver light on the gardens of Willowbrook Manor. In the grove, the ancient trees stood in silent communion with the stars, their roots deep in the earth and their branches reaching toward the heavens. They had witnessed countless seasons, countless cycles of growth and rest, and they would witness countless more. They were teachers and guardians, keepers of ancient wisdom and symbols of endurance and grace. And in the rose room, Eleanor slept peacefully, her dreams filled with the wisdom of seasons and the promise of growth to come. She had found something in the grove that would guide her for the rest of her life, an understanding of her place in the great cycle of existence, and a deep appreciation for the beauty and meaning that could be found in every season of life. The garden's gift. Eleanor woke on her final morning at Willowbrook Manor to the sound of gentle rain against her windows. She had been at the estate for nearly a month now, and the time had passed like a beautiful dream. As she lay in the comfortable bed, listening to the soft patter of raindrops, she felt a complex mixture of emotions: gratitude for all she had experienced, sadness at the thought of leaving, and a profound sense that she had been fundamentally changed by her time here. The gardens had become her sanctuary, her teacher, and her mirror all at once. What had begun as a simple retreat from the chaos of her city life had evolved into something far more transformative. Through tending the roses, walking the ancient paths, and sitting in quiet contemplation among the flowering beds, Eleanor had discovered parts of herself she never knew existed. She rose slowly, wrapping her silk robe around her shoulders, and moved to the window. The rain had softened to a gentle mist, and through it she could see the gardens stretching out below, like a watercolor painting. The roses seemed to glow with an inner light, their petals heavy with moisture. And the old oak tree stood like a sentinel, watching over everything with its ancient wisdom. Today, Mrs. Hartwell had promised to show her the secret garden, a hidden section of the estate that only the most trusted guests were permitted to see. Eleanor had wondered about it for weeks, catching glimpses of a high stone wall covered in climbing vines, always locked, always mysterious. The elderly housekeeper had smiled knowingly whenever Eleanor asked about it, saying only that she would understand when the time was right. Perhaps that time had come on this final day. Eleanor, dressed carefully in her favorite cream-colored dress, one that had become her uniform of sorts during her stay. She had arrived at Willowbrook Manor in sharp business suits and uncomfortable heels. But the estate had a way of softening edges, of inviting a gentler way of being. Now she moved through the world with quieter steps, listened more carefully to the songs of birds, and found herself pausing to truly see the play of light through leaves. Downstairs, Mrs. Hartwell was waiting in the breakfast room with a knowing smile. The woman appeared to be in her 70s, though she carried herself with the grace of someone much younger. Her silver hair was always perfectly arranged, and her eyes held depths that suggested she had seen many guests come and go, each carrying their own stories of transformation. "Good morning, my dear," Mrs. Hartwell said, pouring tea from a delicate porcelain service. "I trust you slept well on your final night with us." Eleanor accepted the cup gratefully, inhaling the fragrant steam. "As well as one can when their heart is heavy with leaving," she replied. "This place has become so precious to me, Mrs. Hartwell. I'm not sure how I'll adjust to city life again." The older woman's eyes crinkled with understanding. "But that's the beauty of what happens here, dear. You don't leave it behind. You carry it forward. The gardens have a way of planting seeds in the soul that continue to grow long after one has departed." Eleanor found herself memorizing every detail, the way the morning light filtered through the lace curtains, the soft tick of the grandfather clock in the corner, the comfortable silence that had developed between her and Mrs. Hartwell over the weeks. "Now then," Mrs. Hartwell said as they finished eating, "I believe it's time for you to see the heart of Willowbrook Manor. The secret garden awaits." Eleanor's pulse quickened with anticipation. She had speculated endlessly about what lay behind that mysterious wall. Was it simply another flower garden? A maze? Something more exotic? Mrs. Hartwell had remained tantalizingly vague, speaking only of it being the source from which all the estate's magic flows. They walked together through the main gardens, past the rose beds where Eleanor had spent countless hours learning to prune and tend, past the herb garden where she had discovered her love of chamomile and lavender, past the reflecting pool where she had sat in meditation on so many mornings. The mist was lifting now, revealing a day that promised to be gloriously clear. At the far end of the property, they came to the stone wall Eleanor knew so well. It was older than the rest of the estate, built from weathered limestone that spoke of centuries past. Ancient wisteria climbed its surface, and ivy created intricate patterns across the stones. In the center was a heavy wooden door, bound with iron hinges that had turned green with age. Mrs. Hartwell produced an ornate key from her pocket, brass and beautifully crafted, with intricate engravings that caught the morning light. "This key," she said, "has been passed down through generations of caretakers. The secret garden is not just a place, Eleanor. It's a trust, a responsibility, and a gift all at once." The lock turned with a satisfying click, and the door swung open on wheel-oiled hinges. Eleanor stepped through and gasped. The secret garden was unlike anything she had imagined. It was circular, perhaps 50 feet in diameter, surrounded entirely by the high stone wall. But what took her breath away was not the size or the shape. It was the extraordinary sense of aliveness that permeated every inch of the space. In the center grew a tree unlike any Eleanor had ever seen. Its trunk was silver white smooth as silk, and its branches reached toward the sky with an elegant grace that seemed almost sentient. The leaves were a deep, rich green that seemed to shimmer with their own inner light, and among them hung fruit that glowed like jewels, some golden, some deep purple, some a warm amber color that pulsed gently dot around the tree. The garden. Beds were arranged in perfect concentric circles, each one containing plants that seemed to exist in their own season. Eleanor saw spring flowers blooming beside summer roses, autumn chrysanthemums growing next to winter evergreens, all thriving together in impossible harmony. But it was the sense of presence that truly amazed her. The garden felt alive in a way that went beyond the normal vitality of growing things. It was as if the very air hummed with consciousness, with awareness, with a deep and abiding peace that seemed to emanate from the silver tree at its heart. "What is this place?" Eleanor whispered, afraid to speak too loudly in such a sacred space. Mrs. Hartwell smiled, her eyes reflecting the gentle light that seemed to permeate everything. "This is the heart garden, dear. It's been here for longer than anyone can remember, tended by generations of caretakers who understood its true nature. Some say it's a place where the veil between worlds grows thin. Others believe it's a gift from the earth itself, a reminder of what paradise might look like." Eleanor walked slowly toward the center, drawn by an invisible force. As she approached the silver tree, she noticed that the fruit hanging from its branches pulsed in rhythm. With her heartbeat, the closer she came, the more synchronized the rhythm became, until she felt as if she and the tree were breathing together. "Go ahead," Mrs. Hartwell encouraged softly. "Touch it. The tree knows you're here." Eleanor reached out with trembling fingers and placed her palm against the smooth silver bark. The moment her skin made contact, the world exploded into sensation. She was no longer Eleanor Jenkins, stressed marketing executive from Chicago. She was the morning dew on a rose petal, the song of a lark at dawn, the gentle sigh of wind through wheat fields. She was the root of the ancient oak, drawing sustenance from deep earth, and the clouds that brought rain to thirsty gardens. She was connection itself, the invisible threads that bound all living things together in an intricate web of interdependence and love. Through this expanded consciousness, she understood that the secret garden was not just a place by a state of being. It was the recognition that all life was sacred, all existence interconnected, all beings part of a greater whole that pulsed with divine love. The tree was not just a tree, but a living symbol of this truth. Its fruit, the sweetness that came from understanding one's place in the grand tapestry of existence. Images flowed through her mind. Visions of the garden through the centuries, tended by monks and mystics, by wise women and healers, exist to remind humanity of its deepest truths. She saw the succession of caretakers, each one chosen not for their horticultural knowledge, but for their capacity to love, to serve, to hold space for others' transformation. And then, as gently as it had begun, the vision faded, leaving Eleanor standing with her hand against the tree, tears streaming down her face. But these were not tears of sadness. They were tears of recognition, of coming home to herself, of understanding at last why she had been drawn to Willowbrook's Manor. "I see it now," she whispered. "I see what this place really is." Mrs. Hartwell nodded, her own eyes bright with emotion. The Heart Garden calls to those who are ready to remember their true nature. It's been calling to you for years, dear, though you may not have recognized its voice above the noise of your busy life. Eleanor sank to her knees beside the tree, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she had experienced. "But I have to leave today. I have to go back to my job, my apartment, my old life. How can I possibly integrate this? How can I carry this truth back into a world that seems to have forgotten it entirely?" Mrs. Hartwell knelt beside her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. The same way a seed carries the memory of the flower it's destined to become. The truth you've touched here doesn't disappear when you leave. It takes root in your heart and grows stronger with each passing day. Your job now is to tend that inner garden, to water it with mindfulness, to give it light through acts of love and service. They sat together in the sacred space, watching the light play through the leaves of the silver tree. Eleanor felt a deep peace settling over her, along with a growing sense of purpose. She had come to Willowbrook Manor, burned out and disconnected, seeking nothing more than rest and recovery. But the gardens had seen deeper needs, had offered healing she didn't even know she required. "There's something else," Mrs. Hartwell said quietly. "The Heart Garden chooses its own caretakers. It's been nearly 40 years since I took on this role, and I've been waiting for the right person to appear. Someone who could not only tend the physical garden, but understand its true significance." Eleanor's heart began to race. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that your old life was just preparation for this moment. Every skill you've learned, every challenge you've faced, every moment of questioning and seeking has brought you to this place. The Heart Garden is offering you a choice, Eleanor. You can return to Chicago and carry its teachings with you, or you can stay and become its next guardian." The words hung in the air like the shimmering fruit on the silver tree. Eleanor felt the weight of the decision. The magnitude of what was being offered. To leave behind everything she had built, everyone she knew, the security of her established life, it seemed impossible. Yet, as she looked around the sacred garden, felt the pulse of life in every plant, every stone, every breath of air, she realized that the impossible was often just another word for the miraculous. I don't know if I'm worthy of such a responsibility, she said honestly. Mrs. Hartwell smiled, the expression lighting up her entire face. My dear, that's exactly what makes you worthy. The heart garden doesn't choose those who believe they deserve it. It chooses those who understand the weight of the gift and approach it with humility and love. As they spoke, Eleanor became aware of a movement in the garden beds around them. The plants seemed to be leaning in, listening, waiting. The silver tree's fruit pulsed more brightly, and somewhere in the distance, she could hear the faint sound of music, not human music, but the harmony of creation itself. I need time to think, Eleanor said, finally. This is the most important decision of my life. Of course, Mrs. Hartwell agreed. It has waited centuries for each of its caretakers to find their way home. They rose together and walked slowly around the perimeter of the sacred space. Eleanor noticed details she had missed in her initial wonder. The way certain plants seemed to glow with their own inner light, the intricate patterns formed by the arrangement of stones and flowers, the sense that every element had been placed with perfect intention at the far side of the garden. Nestled against the stone wall, she discovered a small cottage she hadn't noticed before. It was built of the same weathered limestone as the wall, with a thatched roof and climbing roses covering its walls. Smoke curled from its chimney, and warm light glowed in its windows. The caretaker's cottage, Mrs. Hartwell explained, has been my home for 4 decades. Simple, but everything one needs is their kitchen, sitting room, bedroom, and a wonderful library filled with books about botany, philosophy, and the spiritual dimensions of gardening. Eleanor approached the cottage windows and peered inside. The interior was cozy and inviting, with worn but comfortable furniture, shelves lined with books, and artwork that seemed to capture the essence of the gardens in paint and pencil. On the mantelpiece, she noticed a collection of leather-bound journals, the records of previous caretakers. Mrs. Hartwell said, following her gaze. Each one documented their experiences, their insights, their discoveries about the nature of the heart garden. It's a legacy of wisdom accumulated over generations. As Eleanor continued to explore, she found herself imagining what it would be like to call this place home, to wake each morning to the song of birds and the whisper of wind through leaves, to spend her days tending not just plants, but the deeper mysteries they represented, to welcome guests like herself, offering them the same gift of transformation she had received. The thought both thrilled and terrified her. Her Chicago life felt simultaneously like a prison and a security blanket. She had worked so hard to build her career, to achieve the success that society valued, yet none of it had brought her the peace she felt in this moment, surrounded by the gentle presence of the heart garden. "What happened to your predecessor?" Eleanor asked as they walked back to war. The silver tree, Mrs. Hartwell's expression grew wistful. Margaret was a wonderful woman, a retired teacher who had spent her life nurturing young minds. When she came here, she was grieving the loss of her husband and feeling lost in her purpose. The heart garden called to her as it has called to you. She served for 30 years before passing peacefully in her sleep, right here beneath the silver tree. She said it was like being welcomed home by an old friend. Eleanor felt a chill at the thought of spending her final moments in the garden, but it wasn't an unpleasant sensation. There was something deeply comforting about the idea of being so connected to a place, so rooted in purpose that even death became simply another transition in the eternal cycle of growth and renewal. As the morning progressed, they left the heart garden and toured the rest of the estate. Mrs. Hartwell showed Eleanor the practical aspects of caretaking. The greenhouses where seedlings were nurtured. The composting areas where organic matter was transformed into rich soil. The tool sheds and storage areas that kept everything organized and functional. The estate is largely self-sustaining, Mrs. Hartwell explained. The gardens produce their own compost. We collect rainwater for irrigation, and the solar panels provide electricity. There's a small income from the guest program, people like yourself who come for retreat and restoration. It's not a lavish lifestyle, but it's deeply satisfying. They spend the afternoon in the main gardens, where Eleanor practiced techniques she had learned during her stay. Her hands moved with increasing confidence as she deadheaded roses, weeded herb beds, and watered container plants. The work felt meditative, purposeful, completely different from the frantic pace of her corporate existence. As evening approached, they returned to the manor house for dinner. Mrs. Hartwell had prepared a feast using ingredients from the estates. Gardens, fresh salads, roasted vegetables, herbs that burst with flavor, and fruit that tasted like sunshine. They ate by candlelight, the conversation flowing easily between practical matters and deeper philosophical questions. "Tell me about the other caretakers," Eleanor said as they shared a dessert of poached pears with honey. What were their stories? Mrs. Hartwell's eyes grew distant with memory. Each one was different, yet all were called by the same deep longing. There was James, a former soldier who found peace tending the roses after experiencing the horrors of war. Sarah, a widowed mother, who discovered that nurturing plants helped heal her broken heart. David, a burned-out physician who realized that the earth itself was the greatest healer of all. And you? Eleanor asked softly, "What was your story?" "I was much like you. Actually, a successful businesswoman, driven and accomplished, but feeling increasingly empty despite my achievements. I came here for a weekend and ended up staying for 40 years. The best decision I ever made." After dinner, they walked through the gardens under a canopy of stars. The night air was soft and fragrant, filled with the perfume of night blooming, jasmine, and the gentle rustle of leaves. Eleanor felt a profound sense of belonging, as if every step she took was on holy ground. They paused at the reflecting pool, where the moon's image shimmered on the water's surface. Eleanor knelt and trailed her fingers through the cool water, disturbing the reflection and watching it reform. "I'm afraid," she admitted quietly. "What if I'm not strong enough for this? What if I make the wrong choice?" Mrs. Hartwell sat beside her on the stone bench that ringed the pool. "Fear is natural, dear. Every caretaker has felt it. But think about what you're really afraid of. Is it the unknown, or is it the possibility of finally living the life you were meant to live?" Eleanor considered this, watching the moon's reflection dance on the water. "I think I'm afraid of disappointing everyone, my family, my colleagues. Myself, they'll think I've lost my mind, throwing away everything I've worked for. And what do you think?" "I think I've been losing my mind for years, trying to force myself into a life that never really fit. I think coming here has been the sanest thing I've done in decades." Mrs. Hartwell nodded knowingly. The world has a way of convincing us that security and success are the same thing, but they're not. True security comes from knowing who you are and living in alignment with your deepest values. Success is measured not by what you accumulate, but by how much love you give and receive. They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds of the garden, the gentle splash of water in the fountain, the whisper of wind through trees, the distant hoot of an owl. Eleanor felt her anxiety beginning to settle, replaced by a growing sense of clarity. "If I stay," she said finally, "how would the transition work? I can't just disappear from my old life." Mrs. Hartwell had clearly been thinking about this. "We would take it slowly. You could return to Chicago, settle your affairs, and come back when you're ready. The Heart Garden is patient. It understands that some changes must happen gradually. I could stay for a few months, helping you learn the deeper mysteries of the garden, introducing you to the network of people who support this place. The practicalities of it began to feel manageable. Eleanor could sell her apartment, liquidate her possessions, resign from her job with proper notice. She had enough savings to make the transition comfortably, and the thought of simplifying her life actually felt liberating rather than frightening. "What about visitors?" she asked. "How do you choose who gets to experience this place?" "They choose themselves, really," Mrs. Hartwell replied. "The Heart Garden calls to those who are ready, though they may not understand why they're drawn here. People find us through word of mouth, through dreams, through synchronicities that seem almost magical. Our job is simply to recognize when someone is ready and to hold space for their transformation." As they talked, Eleanor realized that she had been called here too, though she hadn't recognized it at the time. The stress and dissatisfaction that had driven her to seek retreat had been the garden's way of getting her attention. Every step of her journey, from the initial web search that had led her to Willowbrook Manor to the moment she had first stepped through the gates, had been orchestrated by forces beyond her understanding. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the air washed clean by the previous day's rain. Eleanor woke with a sense of certainty that surprised her. The decision that had seemed so monumental the night before now felt inevitable. As natural as the sun rising in the east, she found Mrs. Hartwell in the Heart Garden, tending to the plants in the circular beds. The older woman looked up with a knowing smile as Eleanor approached. "You've decided," Mrs. Hartwell said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Eleanor replied, her voice steady and sure. "I want to stay. I want to learn from you, to serve this place, to become its next caretaker." Mrs. Hartwell's face lit up with joy. "I knew the moment I saw you that you were the one. The Heart Garden has been preparing for your arrival for years." They embraced beside the silver tree, and Eleanor felt the rightness of the decision settle into her bones. This was not an ending, but a beginning. Not a retreat from life, but a stepping into her true purpose. Over the following weeks, Eleanor learned that leaving her old life was easier than she had imagined. Her employer was sorry to lose her, but understood her need for change. Her apartment sold quickly to a young couple who loved its city views. Her possessions, accumulated over years of consumer culture, suddenly seemed unimportant. She kept only what had genuine meaning: family photos, a few treasured books, items that held real memories rather than just monetary value. Her family was initially concerned, as Mrs. Hartwell had predicted, to stage what she called an intervention, convinced that Eleanor had suffered some kind of breakdown. But after spending a weekend at Willowbrook Manor, seeing the peace in Eleanor's eyes and the purposefulness in her movements, she began to understand "You look different," her sister admitted as they walked through the herb garden. "Younger, somehow. More yourself than you've been in years." Eleanor smiled, her hands automatically deadheading spent blooms as they walked. "I feel like I'm finally becoming who I was always meant to be. The person I was in Chicago was just playing a role, trying to fit into expectations that were never really mine." Her parents took longer to understand, but they, too, eventually saw the change in their daughter. The stress lines around her eyes had softened. Her movements had become more graceful, and she spoke with a quiet confidence that had been missing for years. By autumn, Eleanor had officially taken over as head caretaker of Willowbrook Manor. Mrs. Hartwell remained for several more months, sharing the deeper mysteries of the heart garden, teaching Eleanor how to recognize those who were ready for transformation, and passing on the accumulated wisdom of decades. The transition was seamless, as if the garden itself was orchestrating events. Eleanor found herself naturally attuned to the rhythms of the place, understanding instinctively when to intervene and when to simply hold space. She discovered gifts she never knew she possessed, an ability to sense what plants needed, an intuitive understanding of human nature, a capacity for patience that had been buried under years of corporate urgency. Her first solo guest was a young man named Marcus, a tech entrepreneur who had achieved massive success before burning out completely. He arrived at Willowbrook Manor hollow-eyed and disconnected, speaking in the rapid-fire sentences of someone who had forgotten how to be still. Eleanor recognized herself in his restless energy, his inability to simply be present. She guided him gently through the same journey she had taken, watching as the gardens worked their subtle magic on his wounded spirit. By the end of his stay, Marcus was moving with the same unhurried grace that Eleanor had learned, his eyes clear and focused, his speech slower and more thoughtful. "I don't know what you did to me," he said on his final morning, "but I feel like I've been asleep for years and finally woke up." Eleanor smiled, remembering saying something similar to Mrs. Hartwell months earlier. "I didn't do anything. The garden did. I just held space for your transformation." As Marcus left, Eleanor felt the deep satisfaction that came from serving a purpose greater than herself. This was what she had been searching for without knowing it. Not success or recognition, but the simple joy of helping others find their way home to themselves. The seasons turned, and with them, Eleanor's understanding of the heart garden deepened. She learned that the silver tree existed outside normal time, that its fruit contained the essence of pure love, that those who were ready could sometimes glimpse the interconnectedness of all life by simply sitting in its presence. She discovered that the garden beds contained plants from all over the world yet they grew together in perfect harmony. As if the usual rules of climate and soil composition didn't apply. She learned to read the subtle signs that indicated when someone was ready to enter the heart garden, and she developed the wisdom to know when to share its deeper secrets. Winter brought its own gifts. The naked branches of the silver tree revealed intricate patterns that seemed to map the neural networks of consciousness itself. The garden beds, dormant but not dead, whispered of the rest that must come before new growth. Eleanor learned to embrace the quiet months, using them for study and reflection, for deepening her understanding of the mysteries she had been called to serve. Spring's return was a celebration. Eleanor watched in wonder as the garden exploded into bloom, each plant awakening in perfect timing. The whole estate coming alive with the irrepressible force of new life. She felt herself blooming too, growing into her role as caretaker with increasing confidence and joy. Her first full year as head caretaker brought a steady stream of visitors, each one carrying their own story of seeking and need. There was Martha, a retired teacher, struggling with the emptiness of her post-career life. David, a surgeon whose hands had begun to shake from the stress of too many life-and-death decisions. Sarah, a young mother overwhelmed by the demands of caring for 3 small children while maintaining her own sense of identity. Each visitor required a different approach, a different kind of attention. Eleanor learned to read the subtle signs of readiness, to know when someone was prepared for the deeper teachings of the heart garden, and when they simply needed the gentler healing of the regular. Estate gardens, not everyone was ready for the full revelation. Some visitors left after a week or two, refreshed and renewed, but not fundamentally changed. Others, like Eleanor herself, discovered that they had been called to something much greater than a simple retreat. One such visitor was Anna, a former war correspondent who had seen too much suffering and lost her faith in humanity's capacity for goodness. She arrived in late summer, her eyes haunted by images of conflict and cruelty, her heart armored against further pain. Eleanor recognized the depths of Anna's wounding and knew that conventional healing approaches would not be sufficient. She spent weeks simply being present with Anna, offering no advice, no empty reassurances, just the steady companionship of someone who understood that some pain was too deep for words. It was Anna who first showed Eleanor that the heart garden could heal even the most profound trauma. When Anna finally entered the sacred space and placed her hands on the silver tree, she experienced a vision of the interconnectedness of all beings that was so powerful it dissolved years of accumulated cynicism and despair. "I saw it," Anna whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I saw that even in the darkest places, even in the midst of the worst human behavior, the light is still there. The connection is still there, waiting to be recognized. Nas. Healing became a template for Eleanor's work with other deeply wounded souls. She learned that the heart garden's power was not limited to gentle renewal, but could reach into the deepest darkness and kindle hope where none had existed before Dadas. Her second year began. Eleanor found herself being recognized by the broader community of spiritual teachers and healers. Invitations came to speak at conferences, to write articles about her work, to participate in research studies on the healing power of nature. She declined them all, understanding that her role was not to be a public figure, but to serve as a bridge between the mystical and the mundane, helping others find their own path to transformation. The estate's reputation grew quietly through word of mouth and the changed lives of those who had experienced its healing power. Eleanor found herself hosting not just individual visitors, but small groups, cancer survivors seeking renewal, veterans dealing with PTSD, corporate executives questioning their priorities, spiritual seekers hungry for authentic experience. Each group brought its own challenges and gifts. Eleanor learned to hold space for collective transformation, to guide groups through the delicate process of opening to the heart garden's deeper mysteries. She discovered that some of the most profound healing happened in community, when people witnessed each other's courage to change and grow. One particularly powerful group experience involved a dozen women who had all lost children to various tragedies. They came to Willowbrook Manor, carrying grief so profound it seemed to darken the air around them. Eleanor wasn't sure the heart garden could help with such devastating loss, but she trusted in its wisdom and held space for whatever needed to emerge. The breakthrough came when the women entered the heart garden together and discovered that their children's presence could still be felt among the silver tree's branches, not as ghosts or spirits, but as part of the eternal web of love that connected all beings across time and space. The women's grief didn't disappear, but it transformed into something more bearable, a bridge to the sacred rather than a wall, separating them from life. As Eleanor's third year as caretaker began, she realized that her own transformation was far from complete. The heart garden continued to teach her, to challenge her, to reveal new depths of understanding. She was no longer the stressed executive who had arrived seeking nothing more than rest and recovery. She had become a mystic, a healer, a bridge between worlds. Yet she remained profoundly human, still learning, still growing, still occasionally struggling with doubt and fear. The difference was that now she had a container for these experiences, a sacred context that transformed even her difficulties into opportunities for deeper understanding. The estate itself seemed to evolve under her care. New varieties of plants, appeared without being planted, as if the heart garden was expanding its collection of healing allies. The silver tree grew taller and more majestic, its fruit glowing with increasing intensity. The other gardens flourished beyond anything Mrs. Hartwell had achieved, as if responding to Eleanor's particular gifts and vision. Eleanor began to understand that each caretaker brought their own unique qualities to the role, and the heart garden adapted to express their particular wisdom. Where Mrs. Hartwell had been a gentle mother figure, Eleanor was emerging as a powerful catalyst for transformation, capable of helping others navigate even the most challenging passages of growth and change. The network of former visitors grew into an informal community of people committed to carrying the Heart Garden's teachings into the world. They stayed in touch through letters and occasional visits, sharing stories of how their time at Willowbrook Manor continued to influence their lives long after they had left. Marcus, the burned-out tech entrepreneur, had sold his company and founded a nonprofit focused on bringing nature-based healing to underserved communities. Martha, the retired teacher, had started a program for at-risk youth that combined gardening with emotional healing. David, the surgeon, had learned to bring mindfulness and compassion to his medical practice in ways that transformed his relationships with patients. Each success story reinforced Eleanor's understanding that the Heart Garden's true purpose was not to keep people at Willowbrook Manor, but to prepare them to carry its light into the world. The estate was a training ground for healers, a place where ordinary people could discover their extraordinary capacity for love and service. As her fourth year began, Eleanor received an unexpected visitor, a young woman named Claire, who claimed to be Mrs. Hartwell's great niece. Claire had been experiencing vivid dreams about the Heart Garden and felt compelled to visit. Though she had never heard of Willowbrook Manor from her family, Eleanor was initially skeptical, but as she spent time with Claire, she began to sense something familiar about the young woman's presence. Claire moved through the gardens with an instinctive understanding, her hands gentle and knowing as she tended plants, her eyes holding the same depths Eleanor had recognized in Mrs. Hartwell. The truth emerged gradually. Claire was indeed Mrs. Hartwell's great niece, but more than that. She was the next in a line of women who had been called to serve the Heart Garden. The calling skipped generations, appearing when it was needed, in those who carried the right combination of gifts and readiness. Eleanor realized that her time as sole caretaker was drawing to a close. Though she was not yet ready to leave entirely, the Heart Garden was calling for a new model, two caretakers working together, each bringing their unique strengths to the sacred work. The partnership with Claire proved to be deeply enriching. Where Eleanor had become skilled at working with profound trauma and life transitions, Claire brought gifts for working with children and families. Together, they began to host weekend programs for families seeking deeper connection, helping parents and children discover the healing power of nature together. They also began to work with couples at crossroads in their relationships, using the Heart Garden's wisdom to help partners rediscover their love for each other and their shared purpose. The estate's reputation for healing expanded to include relationship counseling, though Eleanor and Claire preferred to think of it as relationship blessing, helping people recognize the sacred dimension of their connections. As Eleanor's fifth year as caretaker unfolded, she found herself thinking often about Mrs. Hartwell, who had passed peacefully in her sleep the previous winter. The older woman had lived her final years in a small cottage in the nearby village, visiting the estate regularly and offering guidance when asked, but trusting Eleanor to follow her own path. Mrs. Hartwell's death had been as graceful as her life. She had spent her final day in the Heart Garden, sitting beneath the silver tree and speaking softly to visitors who had gathered to honor her. As evening fell, she had simply closed her eyes and stepped across the threshold into whatever mystery awaited beyond physical existence. Eleanor had felt the loss deeply, but she had also felt Mrs. Hartwell's continuing presence in the garden. The older woman had become part of the eternal web of love that connected all beings, her wisdom now woven into the very fabric of the sacred space she had tended for so long. The loss had also deepened Eleanor's understanding of her own mortality and the importance of preparing the next generation of caretakers. She began to pay closer attention to visitors who might be called to deeper service, recognizing the signs she had once embodied herself. One such visitor was Thomas, a former military officer who had left the service after a crisis of conscience about his role in perpetuating violence. He arrived at Willowbrook Manor carrying the weight of actions he regretted, seeking not just healing, but a way to make amends for the harm he felt he had caused. Eleanor recognized in Thomas the same deep calling she had experienced years earlier. His transformation in the Heart Garden was profound and immediate. When he placed his hands on the silver tree, he experienced a vision of all the lives he had touched, both in harm and in healing, and understood that his true service lay not in dwelling on past mistakes, but in dedicating his future to peace and restoration. Thomas became the third member of the caretaking team, bringing skills in conflict resolution and trauma healing that proved invaluable. His military background gave him a unique ability to work with veterans and others who had experienced the devastating effects of violence. Under his guidance, Willowbrook Manor began hosting specialized retreats for those seeking to heal from the wounds of war and conflict. The estate's mission continued to evolve and expand. What had begun as a simple retreat center had become a multifaceted healing sanctuary, offering different pathways to transformation depending on each visitor's needs and readiness. The regular gardens provided gentle renewal for those seeking rest and reflection. The specialized programs offered deeper healing for those ready to confront their shadows and embrace profound change. And the heart garden remained the sacred center, the source from which all healing flowed. Eleanor often marveled at how perfectly the pieces came together. Each new caretaker brought exactly the skills and wisdom needed for the estate's next phase of evolution. Each visitor arrived at precisely the right moment when both they and the gardens were ready for the encounter. The synchronicities were so numerous and precise that Eleanor had long since stopped believing in coincidence. As her 6th year began, Eleanor found herself being called to a new level of service. The network of former visitors had grown into a global community of healers and changemakers, all connected by their shared experience of the heart garden's transformative power. They were beginning to establish their own healing centers, each one carrying the essence of Willowbrook Manor into different cultures and contexts. Eleanor began to travel more frequently, visiting these sister sites and offering guidance to those establishing new centers. She discovered that the heart garden's influence was not limited to the physical estate, but could be cultivated anywhere people gathered with the right intention and understanding. In the mountains of Colorado, a former visitor named Rachel had created a wilderness therapy program that combined hiking with spiritual practice. In the urban heart of Detroit, Marcus had transformed an abandoned lot into a community garden that served as both food source and healing space for the surrounding neighborhood. In the aftermath of natural disasters, other alumni had established temporary healing centers that offered more than just physical aid. They provided the deep restoration that comes from remembering one's connection to the web of life. Each of these projects carried the DNA of the heart garden, the understanding that healing happens not through fixing or changing people, but through creating conditions where their own inner wisdom can emerge. Eleanor realized that her role was expanding beyond caretaker of a single estate to midwife of a global movement toward healing and wholeness. The recognition brought new challenges. Media attention began to focus on Willowbrook Manor, with journalists seeking to understand the secret behind its remarkable success rate. Eleanor found herself having to protect the estate's sacred nature while still allowing its influence to spread. She developed a careful balance, sharing the practical aspects of their work while maintaining the mystery that was essential to the heart garden's power. She spoke about the importance of creating sacred space, of honoring the wisdom of nature, of approaching healing with humility and reverence. But she never revealed the full extent of what happened in the heart garden, understanding that some truths could only be experienced directly. The estate's reputation attracted visitors from around the world, including spiritual teachers, scientists studying consciousness, and healers seeking to understand the mechanisms behind the transformations that occurred there. Eleanor welcomed genuine seekers, while gently discouraging those who came seeking to exploit or commercialize the estate's gifts. One particularly challenging visitor was Dr. Harrison, a neuroscientist who wanted to study the brain patterns of people experiencing the heart garden's effects. He arrived with sophisticated equipment and a reductionist mindset, convinced that he could explain the garden's power through purely physical mechanisms. Eleanor allowed him to conduct his studies, knowing that the heart garden's truth was too vast to be contained by any single perspective. Dr. Harrison's instruments did, indeed, record interesting patterns, increased alpha waves, heightened activity in areas associated with compassion and connection, measurable changes in stress, hormones. But the data only scratched the surface of what was actually happening. The breakthrough came when Dr. Harrison volunteered to experience the heart garden himself. Like so many others, he entered the sacred space as a skeptic and emerged as a believer, though his beliefs had been transformed rather than confirmed. He continued his research, but now with an understanding that consciousness was far more mysterious and miraculous than his instruments could measure. Eleanor's seventh year brought new challenges in the form of increased demand for the estate's services. The waiting list for individual retreats stretched for months, and the specialized programs filled up as soon as they were announced. Eleanor wrestled with the question of expansion. Should they build more facilities, train more staff, find ways to serve more people? The answer came during a deep meditation in the heart garden. Eleanor realized that the estate's power lay not in its size, but in its intimacy, not in serving more people, but in serving each person more completely. The heart garden itself showed her that growth could happen through depth rather than breadth, through the quality of transformation rather than the quantity of visitors. Instead of expanding the physical facilities, Eleanor and her team developed new ways to extend the estate's influence. They created online programs that could prepare people for their visit, helping them arrive in a more receptive state. They established a network of certified guides who could offer heart garden principles in their own communities. They developed partnerships with hospitals, schools, and other institutions that wanted to incorporate healing garden principles into their work. The most innovative development was the creation of seed gardens, small, sacred spaces that could be established anywhere people gathered with the intention of healing and growth. These pocket-sized versions of the heart garden required no special plants or elaborate landscaping, just a circle of stones, a small tree or a large plant, and the commitment to honor the space as sacred. Eleanor traveled, established these seed gardens, teaching others how to create and maintain sacred space. She discovered that the heart garden's essence could indeed be transplanted, though each new location expressed it in its own unique way. Urban rooftops, hospital courtyards, school playgrounds, corporate offices, all could become sites of transformation when approached with the right. Understanding the Seed Garden Project created a global network of connected sacred spaces, each one a node in an expanding web of healing and awakening. Eleanor began to envision a world where sacred gardens were as common as coffee shops, where people could find refuge and renewal in every neighborhood, where the artificial separation between spiritual and mundane life finally dissolved. As her 8th year began, Eleanor found herself contemplating her own next phase of evolution. She had grown from a burned-out executive to a master gardener of souls, from someone seeking healing to someone capable of facilitating profound transformation in others. But she sensed that even this role was not her final destination. The heart garden was teaching her about the cycles of service, how each role prepared one for the next, how mastery in one area opened doorways to greater mysteries. She began to understand that her time as primary caretaker of Willowbrook Manor was drawing to a close. Not because she was failing, but because she was succeeding so completely that the garden was ready to release her to greater service. The transition began when Eleanor received an invitation to speak at the United Nations about the role of sacred spaces in global healing. The opportunity came through Dr. Harrison, whose research had caught the attention of international health organizations. They wanted to understand how the principles behind Willowbrook Manor could be applied to refugee camps, disaster zones, and other places where traditional healing approaches had proven insufficient. Eleanor accepted the invitation, knowing that it represented a watershed moment. She would be stepping onto a global stage, speaking not just about gardening or healing, but about the fundamental transformation of consciousness that was needed to address humanity's greatest challenges. Her speech at the UN was both simple and revolutionary. She spoke about the power of sacred space to heal trauma, the importance of reconnecting with nature for psychological health, and the need for healing approaches that address the whole person rather than just symptoms. But more than that, she spoke about the possibility of transformation on a global scale, the vision of a world where every community had access to the kind of deep healing that she had witnessed at Willowbrook Manor. The response was overwhelming. Government officials, NGO leaders, and health professionals from around the world wanted to learn more. Eleanor found herself at the center of a movement that was much larger than she had imagined. A global recognition that humanity's problems required spiritual as well as practical solutions. The work expanded rapidly. Eleanor helped establish healing gardens in refugee camps where traumatized families could find moments of peace and connection. She worked with urban planners to integrate sacred space into city design, creating pockets of tranquility in the midst of metropolitan chaos. She collaborated with educators to develop curricula that combined academic learning with spiritual growth, helping children develop both intellectual and emotional intelligence. Each project carried the essence of the heart garden, the understanding that healing happens when people remember their connection to something greater than themselves. Whether expressed through a simple circle of stones or an elaborate botanical garden, the principle remained the same: create sacred space with intention and love, and transformation will follow. Eleanor's 9th year brought recognition from unexpected quarters. Environmental scientists began studying the ecological benefits of the healing gardens, finding that they created havens for wildlife and contributed to urban biodiversity. Psychologists documented the mental health benefits of regular exposure to sacred nature spaces. Economists calculated the cost savings that resulted from reduced healthcare needs in communities with healing gardens. But for Eleanor, the most meaningful recognition came from the thousands of people whose lives had been transformed by their encounters with the heart garden and its offshoots. She received letters from all over the world, from veterans who had found peace, from parents who had healed their relationships with their children, from business leaders who had discovered more meaningful ways to serve their communities. Each letter reminded her of why she had been called to this work. The external recognition was gratifying, but the real reward was knowing that the love she had discovered in the heart garden was now flowing through countless lives, creating ripples of healing that would continue long after she was gone, as her 10th year as caretaker began. Eleanor realized that she had come full circle. She was no longer the stressed executive who had arrived seeking rest, nor was she the novice gardener learning to tend roses. She had become something she never could have imagined: a bridge between worlds, a translator of mysteries, a gardener of global consciousness. The heart garden had never stopped teaching her, never stopped, revealing new depths of understanding. But now she understood that her primary learning was complete. She had mastered the art of creating sacred space, of holding space for transformation, of recognizing and nurturing the seeds of awakening in others. The time had come to pass the torch to a new generation of caretakers while stepping into her own next phase of service. Eleanor began to prepare Claire and Thomas for greater responsibility, sharing the deepest mysteries of the heart garden that she had learned through years of patient observation and practice. The transition was gradual and organic. Eleanor spent increasing amounts of time traveling, establishing new healing centers, and training new facilitators. Claire and Thomas took on more of the day-to-day operations of Willowbrook Manor, proving themselves capable of maintaining the estate's sacred mission while adding their own gifts to its expression. Eleanor's final act as primary caretaker was to establish the Heart Garden Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting healing gardens around the world. The foundation would provide funding, training, and resources to communities wanting to establish their own sacred spaces, ensuring that the work would continue to grow and evolve long after Eleanor had moved on to other service. The foundation's launch was marked by a global celebration, with healing gardens around the world holding simultaneous ceremonies to honor the network of sacred spaces that had grown from the single silver tree at Willowbrook Manor. Eleanor participated via video link, standing beside the tree that had started it all, as she looked into the camera, addressing hundreds of communities around the world. Eleanor felt the presence of all who had come before: Mrs. Hartwell, Margaret, and the long line of caretakers who had tended the sacred flame. She also felt the presence of all who would come after, the new generation of healers and gardeners who would carry the work forward into an uncertain but hopeful future. The Heart Garden teaches us that we are all connected, Eleanor said, her voice carrying across oceans and continents. Every act of healing, every moment of compassion, every choice to choose love over fear contributes to the healing of our world. We are not separate gardeners tending separate plots. We are one garden, one heart, one love, expressing itself through countless forms. The ceremony ended with a moment of silence, observed simultaneously by thousands of people around the world. In that silence, Eleanor felt the network of connection that had grown from her single decision to stay at Willowbrook Manor, to answer the call of the Heart Garden, to serve something greater than herself. As the years passed, Eleanor continued to serve the global healing movement, but in an increasingly advisory role. She had become an elder, a wisdom keeper, someone who could see the larger patterns and help guide the movement's evolution. The estate itself thrived under Claire and Thomas's leadership, continuing to evolve while maintaining its essential character. New caretakers were called to join the team, each bringing their own gifts and perspectives. The estate became a training ground for healing facilitators, a place where the next generation of gardeners could learn to tend both plants and souls. The waiting list for programs remained long. But the network of satellite centers meant that the Heart Garden's influence was available to anyone who truly sought it. Eleanor's final years were spent in a small cottage on the estate grounds, close enough to the Heart Garden to feel its presence, but far enough from the main activities to maintain the quiet she needed for writing and reflection. She had become the unofficial historian of the movement, documenting the stories of transformation and the evolution of healing practices. Her memoirs, The Garden's Gift, A Life of Sacred Service, became a bestseller and introduced millions of people to the possibilities of spiritual healing and sacred space. But Eleanor was most proud of the simple guidebook she wrote for creating healing gardens, a practical manual that made the Heart Garden's wisdom accessible to anyone with a small plot of land and a sincere desire to serve Dot. As Eleanor's earthly journey drew to a close, she felt nothing but gratitude for the path she had chosen. She had lived a life of purpose and meaning, had contributed to the healing of countless individuals and communities, had helped plant seeds of transformation that would continue to grow for generations to come. Her final morning came peacefully, just as Mrs. Hartwell's had years before. Eleanor woke before dawn and walked slowly to the Heart Garden, where she sat beneath a silver tree and watched the sun rise over the estate she had served so faithfully. As the light grew stronger, she felt herself becoming part of the eternal web of love that connected all beings. Her individual consciousness merging with the greater consciousness that animated all life. They found her there, hours later, sitting peacefully against the tree's silver trunk, a smile on her face and her hands resting on the earth she had tended with such devotion. The garden around her seemed to glow with extra brilliance, as if celebrating her homecoming. Eleanor's memorial service was held in the Heart Garden, attended by hundreds of people whose lives she had touched. But the real memorial was the network of healing gardens that continued to flourish around the world, each one a living testament to the power of sacred space and the difference one person can make when they answer the call of their deepest purpose. The Heart Garden itself remained unchanged, continuing to work its quiet magic on all who entered with open hearts. The silver tree grew taller and more magnificent with each passing year, its fruit glowing with the accumulated love of all who had served its mission. New caretakers were called, new visitors arrived, seeking transformation and the eternal cycle of healing and growth continued. And sometimes, in the quiet moments between dawn and sunrise, those who knew how to listen could hear Eleanor's voice in the whisper of wind through leaves, still teaching, still guiding, still reminding all who would listen that the greatest gift anyone can give is to tend the garden of their own awakening and share its fruits with a world in need of healing. The story of Willowbrook Manor and its heart garden became legend. But the reality it represented was far more important than any story. It was proof that transformation is possible, that healing is real, that love is the most powerful force in the universe. It was a reminder that each person carries within them the seeds of their own awakening, waiting only for the right conditions to sprout and flourish. And in gardens, both great and small, in healing centers scattered across the globe, in the quiet corners of urban parks and the sacred spaces of human hearts, the gift of the garden continues to unfold, one transformation at a time, one healed heart at a time, one act of love at a time. The garden's gift was not just healing, it was the recognition that we are all gardeners, all caretakers, all responsible for tending the sacred space of our shared world. Eleanor had learned this lesson well, and through her service, she had helped countless others discover it to dot in the end. That was the truest gift of all, not the miraculous healings or the profound transformations, but the simple understanding that we are all connected, all part of one great garden of consciousness, all called to tend our small corner of the world with love, patience, and unwavering faith in the possibility of growth. The heart garden's legacy lived on, not in any single place or person, but in the countless acts of compassion and care that rippled out from those who had touched its mystery. Each person who chose love over fear, each community that created sacred space, each act of healing and hope was a continuation of the garden's eternal gift. And so the story continued, without end, as all true stories do, not in the pages of books or the memories of those who lived it, but in the living reality of transformed lives and healing hearts, in the eternal spring of love that flows from the source of all being, in the garden that exists not just in any one place, but in the awakened consciousness of all who remember their true nature. The garden's gift was nothing less than the gift of remembering who we really are. Not separate beings struggling alone, but interconnected expressions of one great love, called to serve the healing of our world through the simple act of tending, with infinite care and patience, the sacred garden of our own awakening hearts.